My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old. At a lavish family dinner, I clutched my stomach and gasped that I was about to give birth. My parents just sneered and told me to call a cab because they were busy. I drove myself to the emergency room in blinding agony, bleeding onto the driver's seat of my car. A week later, my mother knocked on my door with a fake smile saying, "Let me see the baby." I looked her dead in the eye and replied, "What baby?" Before I dive into exactly how I systematically destroyed my toxic family and took back my $200 million empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic blood relatives to protect your own peace. The nightmare began exactly 1 month ago during what was supposed to be a flawless evening. The setting was my parents' sprawling estate in the most exclusive zip code of Atlanta. It was a crisp Saturday night, and the mansion was buzzing with the city elite. Local politicians, prominent business owners, and board members of the most prestigious social clubs were all gathered to celebrate the 5th wedding anniversary of my younger sister Jada and her husband Trent. Jada was the undisputed golden child of our family. She had the perfect blowout, the perfect designer gowns, and the perfect socially acceptable marriage to Trent, a white finance executive who my parents treated like absolute royalty. My mother Vivian treated Trent as if his presence validated our family status in high society. I was heavily pregnant, just days away from my due date, carrying a child conceived through a sperm donor. To my image-obsessed mother, my status as a soon-to-be single mother was a deep embarrassment. She could not hide me completely, but she found a way to render me invisible. Instead of mingling as a guest, I was relegated to the background. Vivian had ordered me to help the catering staff, whispering that an unwed pregnant woman waddling around the main hall would draw the wrong kind of questions from her elite friends. So there I was, 32 years old, 9 months pregnant, and my feet swelling painfully against my sensible black flats as I cleared empty plates and half-eaten appetizers from the dining tables. The grand dining room was a symphony of wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over imported floral centerpieces and silver cutlery. Laughter echoed off the high ceilings as Trent stood near the fireplace holding a glass of aged bourbon. He was loudly recounting a supposed real estate triumph, inflating his own ego, while my parents nodded along in absolute adoration. Jada stood beside him, draped in a sparkling emerald gown, soaking up the attention. No one noticed the heavy sweat gathering on my forehead. No one cared that my breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. I had been feeling dull cramps since that morning, but I brushed them off as normal pregnancy pains. I was supposed to have at least another week. I balanced a heavy stack of greasy porcelain plates on my left arm, my right hand resting protectively over my massive belly. I just needed to make it to the kitchen, set the plates down, and finally sit. But as I took a step across the priceless vintage Italian rug that anchored the room, a pain unlike anything I had ever experienced ripped through my lower abdomen. It was not a dull ache. It was a violent tearing sensation that stole the oxygen from my lungs. My vision blurred into a sea of dark spots. I gasped, bending forward instinctively as my knees buckled beneath my own weight. The heavy porcelain plates slipped from my grip. They hit the hardwood floor and the edge of the Italian rug with a deafening crash. The sound of shattering plates echoed like a gunshot, silencing the entire room instantly. The string quartet in the corner faltered and stopped playing. Dozens of eyes snapped in my direction. But the shattered plates were not the worst part. At the exact moment the porcelain hit the floor, a warm, sudden rush of fluid flooded down my legs. My water had broken, but it was not just clear fluid. I looked down in absolute horror to see a pool of water heavily mixed with bright red blood seeping into the cream-colored fibers of my mother's expensive rug. I dropped to my hands and knees, fighting through another blinding wave of pain. I could barely breathe, let alone speak. I reached a trembling hand out, looking up at the sea of faces, desperately searching for my mother, my sister, anyone who would rush to my side. Vivian was the first to move, but she did not run to catch me or ask if I was okay. Instead, my mother jumped backward with shocking speed, her eyes wide with disgust. She looked down at her feet, frantically inspecting her beige Jimmy Choo heels to ensure my blood and amniotic fluid had not splashed onto the designer leather. She let out a sharp, dramatic gasp of horror that had nothing to do with my medical emergency. "My God, Maya, you are ruining your sister's party!" Vivian hissed, her voice cutting through the silent room like a blade. Her face was contorted with fury, completely devoid of any maternal instinct. She actually grabbed a cloth napkin from a nearby table and tossed it in my direction, as if I had spilled a glass of wine rather than gone into traumatic labor. "Do you always have to be the center of attention? Look at this mess." I knelt there in my own blood, paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of her words. The pain in my abdomen was escalating, wrapping around my spine like a vice, but the emotional blow was paralyzing. Trent stepped forward, swirling his bourbon glass, his face twisted in deep annoyance. He did not offer a hand. He did not call for a doctor. He looked down at the stained rug and sighed loudly. "Are you kidding me?" Trent complained, shaking his head. "That rug was imported from Milan. Tell her to call a cab or something. We cannot have an ambulance flashing its lights out front. It will kill the mood of the entire evening." I shifted my desperate gaze to Jada, my own sister, hoping for a shred of empathy. Jada simply crossed her arms over her emerald gown, a tiny, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She looked at me, struggling on the floor like I was an unruly pest that had wandered in from the street. She did not say a single word to defend me. She just turned her back and whispered something to her wealthy friends, pretending I did not exist. My father Marcus finally emerged from the crowd. I reached my bloody hand toward him, but he stopped 3 feet away, his expression hard and embarrassed. He looked at the high society guests, staring at our family drama. "Go outside, Maya," my father muttered under his breath, leaning down just enough so only I could hear. "Go have your baby somewhere else. Do not throw a tantrum in here and ruin our reputation." In that agonizing moment, kneeling in shards of broken porcelain and a growing pool of my own blood, a profound and chilling clarity washed over me. I was completely and utterly alone. These people sharing my DNA would rather watch me bleed to death on their floor than suffer a moment of social embarrassment. The family I had spent my entire life trying to please did not view me as a daughter or a sister. I was an inconvenience, a stain on their perfect image. I gritted my teeth, tasting the metallic tang of blood where I had bitten my own lip. I did not scream. I did not beg for their help again. I pressed my hands against the floor and forced myself to stand, ignoring the excruciating pain ripping through my body. The thrown napkin fluttered to the floor, landing mere inches from a pair of impeccably polished Italian leather Oxfords. I did not have to look up to know they belonged to Trent. My brother-in-law stepped forward, the ice clinking lazily against the crystal of his bourbon glass. He did not rush to my side. He did not ask if I was experiencing a medical emergency or if the baby was in danger. Instead, he stared down at the growing pool of red staining the floorboards with an expression of profound irritation. Trent was a man who styled himself as a high-powered finance executive, a white man who had married into our affluent Atlanta family and paraded around as if he had built our real estate empire with his own 2 hands. I knew the truth. I knew his investment firm was a mirage propped up by the quiet, steady siphoning of my sister Jada's trust fund. But tonight, in his bespoke tuxedo surrounded by the elite of our city, he played the role of the master of the house to perfection. He let out a sharp, exasperated sigh, completely ignoring the fact that I was on my hands and knees, gasping for air through a contraction that felt like my spine was being crushed. "Tell her to call an Uber or something," Trent muttered, swirling his drink. He turned his attention to my mother, his tone dripping with condescension. "Vivian, we need to get the cleaning staff in here immediately. That rug is a custom import from Milan. If that stain sets, the whole piece is ruined. We cannot have the guests stepping around this mess all evening." I stared at the pristine toe of his shoe, my vision swimming. A custom import from Milan. My sister's husband was negotiating the preservation of a carpet while my blood soaked into its fibers. He spoke about me in the third person, treating me not as his pregnant sister-in-law, but as a biological hazard that had inconvenienced his anniversary celebration. Beside him, Jada shifted her weight. She did not rush forward to offer me a hand. She did not scream for someone to call 911. My younger sister simply crossed her arms over her sparkling emerald gown and looked down at me. A slow, chilling smirk spread across her perfectly contoured face. This was the moment she had waited her entire life for. For 32 years, she had competed with me. I was the one who worked quietly, the one who carried the heavy burdens, the one who never asked for praise. But Jada was the golden child, the one who demanded the spotlight and received it unconditionally. Now seeing me broken, bleeding, and entirely helpless on the floor validated every delusion of superiority she held. She leaned her head against Trent's shoulder, a picture of marital perfection contrasting violently with my isolated agony. She said absolutely nothing. Her silence was a weapon sharper and more devastating than any insult she could have hurled at me. Before I could even attempt to push myself up from the floor, the heavy hand-carved oak doors of the cigar lounge swung open. The rich, suffocating scent of aged tobacco and expensive cologne rolled into the main hall. The murmuring crowd parted immediately. My father Marcus strode into the room. He was the patriarch, a man whose entire existence was predicated on control image and the unwavering obedience of everyone in his orbit. He adjusted the lapels of his custom suit, his face a mask of furious authority, as his eyes locked onto me, kneeling in the center of the disaster. I raised a trembling hand toward him, the desperate instinctive reflex of a child looking for her father's protection. But the moment his gaze met mine, any illusion of paternal love I still harbored shattered completely. There was no concern in his eyes. There was only raw, unadulterated disgust. "Go give birth by yourself," Maya Marcus commanded. His voice was low, vibrating with a quiet rage that carried perfectly across the hushed dining room. He stopped several feet away, deliberately keeping his distance from the blood and the fluid. "I told you this would happen. You do not have a husband. You have no ring on your finger. So do not come out here and throw a tantrum in the middle of a high society event looking for pity." My chest heaved. I tried to speak, tried to tell him that something was terribly wrong with the baby, but the pain robbed me of my voice. Marcus did not care to hear it anyway. He stepped closer, towering over me, his words striking me with the force of physical blows. "I warned you not to go to that clinic," he hissed, leaning down so his words struck me directly. "I told you that using a sperm donor was an embarrassment. You are a single woman bringing a fatherless child into a family that prides itself on traditional excellence. You made a mockery of this house the day you decided you did not need a man to build a family. Now you are bleeding on the floor, humiliating us in front of the entire community. Get up, walk out the back door so the guests do not have to look at you, and figure it out yourself." The words echoed in my ears, ringing louder than the music that had abruptly stopped playing. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with absolute terrifying clarity. My father did not hate me because I was a failure. He hated me because my independence threatened his patriarchal control. By choosing to have a child on my own terms through a donor, without tethering myself to a man he could manipulate, or a marriage he could leverage for business, I had broken his ultimate rule. I had proven that I did not need his permission to live my life, and for that he was perfectly willing to let me die on this floor. I looked at the four of them forming a wall of hostility around me. Vivian clutching her designer dress, mourning the disruption of her party. Trent, the white savior of the family finances, mourning a piece of woven fabric from Milan. Jada, glowing with the satisfaction of my public humiliation. And Marcus, the proud patriarch, punishing me for my autonomy. They were not my family. They were a corporation, and I had just become a liability. A second contraction hit, tearing through my abdomen with the force of a freight train. It forced a ragged, breathless gasp from my throat, but I bit down on my tongue so hard I tasted copper. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a scream. I refused to let them see me beg. If I stayed on this floor waiting for a shred of humanity to awaken in their cold hearts, I would lose my child. I planted my palms flat against the hardwood floor, right into the sticky warmth of my own blood. My arms shook violently under the strain, my muscles screaming in protest. Every nerve ending in my body begged me to stay down, to curl into a ball and wait for rescue. But the fire igniting in my chest burned hotter than the physical agony. It was a dark, consuming fuel. It was the realization that from this moment forward, I owed these people absolutely nothing. I forced my right foot flat onto the floor, then my left. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself up. My ruined silk dress clung to my legs. The room spun wildly, the crystal chandeliers overhead blurring into streaks of bright light. I swayed, nearly collapsing backward, but I caught myself. I stood upright, swaying slightly but bearing my own weight. I did not look at Trent. I did not look at Jada. I did not even look at my father. I locked my jaw, turned my back on the entire room, and began to put one foot in front of the other. I walked away from the glittering party, leaving a trail of bloody footprints across the imported Italian rug, heading straight toward the front door to fight for my life alone. The humid Atlanta night air hit my face like a physical wall the moment I pushed through the heavy double doors of my parents' estate. Every step down the grand stone staircase sent a fresh wave of agony radiating from my pelvis straight up my spine. My luxury SUV was parked at the end of the circular driveway. The 50 yards between me and my car felt like a marathon through a minefield. I fumbled for my keys with hands slick with my own sweat and blood. I threw myself into the driver's seat, letting out a guttural groan as my body hit the leather upholstery. I locked the doors instantly. Through the tinted windows, I could see the silhouette of the caterers moving around inside the brightly lit mansion, completely oblivious to the fact that the daughter of the house was fighting for her life in the driveway. I jammed my finger against the ignition button. The engine roared to life. I did not bother looking back at the house that had always been my prison. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The drive to the hospital was a blur of neon streetlights and blinding pain. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned stark white. With every contraction, the world around me faded into a dangerous dark tunnel. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted fresh blood just to keep myself conscious. My mind flashed back to my childhood, to all the times I was told I was too stubborn, too independent, too difficult to love. They thought stripping me of their support would break me. They thought I would crawl back inside and beg for Marcus to call an ambulance. They underestimated exactly how much I was willing to endure to protect my child. I swerved into the emergency room bay, slamming the brakes just inches from the sliding glass doors. I barely managed to throw the car into park before the door was pulled open from the outside. A triage nurse took one look at my blood-soaked dress and immediately started shouting for a gurney. Hands grabbed me, pulling me onto a stretcher as the world began to spin out of control. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital ceiling flashed by in a dizzying sequence as they rushed me down the sterile white corridors. Medical staff swarmed around me like a well-oiled machine. They cut away my ruined silk dress and hooked me up to a dozen different monitors. The chaotic noise of the emergency room was suddenly cut through by a sharp, terrifying sound. The fetal heart monitor began to wail. The steady, rapid heartbeat of my baby suddenly plunged, dropping lower and lower with every passing second. The panic in the room was instant and palpable. A doctor rushed to the side of my bed, his face grim and urgent. "Your baby is in severe distress," the doctor said, his voice loud to cut through the alarms. "The umbilical cord is compromised, and you are losing too much blood. We need to perform an emergency cesarean section right now, or you will both die." My vision was fading. The pain had reached a threshold my brain could no longer process, leaving me in a state of paralyzing shock. I felt my hands shaking violently. "We need your emergency contact on the line to confirm your medical history and next of kin protocols before we put you under general anesthesia," a nurse said urgently, holding up my unlocked phone. I hit redial on the last contact. "It is your mother." Before I could tell her to hang up, the call connected. The nurse quickly hit the speaker button, holding the phone near my face. The sound of clinking glasses and upbeat jazz music filled the sterile trauma bay, a jarring contrast to the blaring medical alarms keeping me alive. Vivian, the nurse, spoke quickly, her voice tight with professional panic. "This is Atlanta General Hospital. Your daughter Maya has been admitted with severe hemorrhaging. The fetal heart rate is dropping dangerously low. We need verbal confirmation of her medical history for an emergency surgery right now." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Even the doctors and nurses froze, waiting for the frantic, panicked response of a concerned mother. Instead, a heavy sigh echoed through the speaker. Oh, please, Vivian sneered, her voice dripping with absolute annoyance. Do not fall for her theatrics. She is just acting out because we refuse to cater to her little tantrum at our party. Let her handle it herself. We are in the middle of cutting Jada and Trent's anniversary cake, and I am not stepping away to deal with this nonsense. But Mom, the nurse started, her eyes widening in pure shock. This is a life or death situation. Then she should have thought about that before she decided to get pregnant without a husband. Vivian snapped back coldly. Do not call this number again. A sharp click echoed through the trauma room. The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavier than any physical weight I had ever felt. The medical team stood frozen around my bed, their faces painted with a mixture of absolute horror and profound pity. The doctor looked down at me, his eyes softening with a deep, uncomfortable sympathy. It was the kind of look you give a stray animal left out in the freezing rain. I hated that look. I hated that my mother had reduced me to an object of pity in front of strangers. The physical pain ripping through my body was nothing compared to the fiery, consuming rage that ignited in my chest. They had finally done it. They had completely washed their hands of my existence just to slice a piece of vanilla cake. I reached out with a trembling, blood-stained hand and grabbed the clipboard from the nurse. I did not shed a single tear. The time for crying over people who wanted me dead had officially passed. Give me the pen. I said, my voice shockingly steady despite the alarms blaring around me. The nurse handed me the pen, her hand shaking slightly. I signed my name at the bottom of the consent form with sharp, deliberate strokes. I shoved the clipboard back against her chest and looked the doctor dead in the eye. Just cut, I commanded. Do whatever you have to do to save my son. I do not have a family. It is just me and him. The doctor nodded, his professional demeanor snapping instantly back into place. He barked orders at the team, and the stretcher lurched forward, crashing through the double doors toward the operating theater. The anesthesiologist positioned the mask over my face, telling me to count backward from 10. The sweet, heavy fog of the gas began to fill my lungs, pulling me down into a dark, heavy sleep. But just as my eyes began to close, the bright screen of my phone lit up on the metal tray beside my head. A single text message notification flashed across the locked screen. It was from the senior partner at my late grandfather's private law firm. The text was short, but it carried the weight of a loaded gun. It is time to activate your grandfather's will. Let me know when the heir is born. A slow, cold smile crept across my face beneath the oxygen mask. My family thought they had discarded me. They thought they had thrown away a useless, unwed daughter to protect their high society image. They had no idea that they had just handed the keys to their entire $200 million empire directly to the woman they had left to die. 3, 2, 1. The darkness finally took me, and for the first time in my life, I welcomed it. Because I knew exactly what was coming for them when I woke up. The heavy hand-carved oak doors of my foyer were pushed open without a single knock. Vivian and Marcus marched into my home exactly as they marched through life, as if they owned the very air they were breathing. My mother led the charge. Vivian was dressed to the nines in a crisp white tailored suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, not a single strand out of place. She looked like she was stepping onto the cover of a high society magazine, rather than visiting the daughter she had left to bleed out on a dining room floor. Hanging from the crook of her arm was a massive, ludicrously expensive designer baby bag wrapped in signature ribbons. "Oh, my beautiful girl!" Vivian cooed, her voice pitched an octave higher than normal, dripping with a sugary sweetness that made my stomach turn. She rushed forward, her heels clicking loudly against the floorboards. She stopped just 2 feet away from my armchair, hovering with her arms outstretched, as if waiting for me to leap up and embrace her. "Mommy is here. We came as soon as we possibly could." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The porcelain clinked softly against the saucer as I lowered it to my lap. I stared at her. I let the silence stretch heavy and suffocating until the fake plastic smile on her face began to twitch at the corners. "As soon as you possibly could," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper, entirely devoid of emotion. Marcus stepped out from behind her, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his custom trousers. He immediately began pacing the length of my living room, his eyes darting across the vaulted ceilings. the original artwork on the walls, and the expansive view of the Atlanta skyline. I was evaluating the space, calculating its worth with the cold, predatory gaze of a real estate mogul. "Now, Maya, do not start with that ungrateful attitude," Marcus commanded, his deep voice booming across the room. "Your mother and I have had a grueling week. Jada was absolutely inconsolable after your little stunt ruined her anniversary dinner. We spent days doing damage control with our friends. You know how the rumor mill in our circle works. We had to protect the family reputation first. But we are here now, so let us put that unfortunate misunderstanding behind us." A misunderstanding. That was what my father called a near-fatal hemorrhage and an emergency cesarean section. A misunderstanding. Vivian nodded vigorously, stepping closer to my chair and setting the designer baby bag down on my marble coffee table. "Exactly," she chimed in, waving her manicured hand as if erasing the past week from existence. "We are a family, Maya. Families fight, but blood always brings us back together. I even went to the luxury boutique downtown this morning. Look, I brought cashmere blankets, silver pacifiers, and organic formula. Only the absolute best for my grandchild." I watched her unpack the items, laying them out on the table like offerings on an altar. This was the same woman who had screamed at me to get my blood off her imported rug. This was the woman who had hung up the phone on an emergency room nurse. The sheer terrifying audacity of her performance was almost mesmerizing to witness. They had not come here to apologize. They had not come here out of guilt. People like Vivian and Marcus did not experience guilt. They only experienced calculated ambition. They were here because they wanted something. I could smell the greed rolling off them like cheap perfume. Marcus walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, tapping the thick glass with his knuckle. "I have to admit, Maya, I am surprised," he said, looking down at the bustling city streets below. "When you refused to give the hospital our home address for your discharge papers, I had my assistant track down this location. I expected to find you in some cramped, rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, but a penthouse in the absolute center of the financial district." He turned to face me, a condescending smirk twisting his lips. "You are playing a very dangerous game with your finances, little girl." I kept my face perfectly blank. I let him talk. "Renting a place like this on a standard corporate salary is financial suicide." Marcus continued, stepping closer to me and crossing his arms. "You are a single mother now. You cannot afford to live in a luxury high-rise just to prove a point. You are going to bankrupt yourself before the boy even learns to walk. It is a good thing your mother and I decided to step in. We are willing to help you out of this lease and move you into one of our older rental properties in the suburbs. We will cut you a deal on the rent, of course. Keep it in the family." I was trying to establish dominance. He was trying to remind me that he held the purse strings, that he was the patriarch, the provider, the sole source of security. He genuinely believed I was drowning in debt to rent this penthouse. He had absolutely no idea that I owned the entire building beneath his feet. I leaned back in my armchair, crossing my legs slowly, ignoring the sharp pull of my stitches. "That is very generous of you, Marcus," I said, keeping my tone terrifyingly polite. "But I am quite comfortable right here." Vivian let out an exasperated sigh, abandoning her display of baby gifts. "Maya, stop being so stubborn for once in your miserable life. Your father is offering you a lifeline. You have a child to think about now. You cannot be selfish anymore. We are here to bring you back into the fold, to give this child the proper foundation he deserves. A child needs a strong family, strong connections." She stepped right up to the edge of my chair, clasping her hands together in front of her chest, her eyes wide with a frantic, hungry energy. She leaned down, invading my personal space, her voice dropping into a breathless, demanding pitch. "Now enough of this chit-chat," Vivian insisted, her fake smile returning with a vengeance. "Oh, daughter, Mom is here to visit the firstborn grandson. Where is he hiding? Bring him out here. Let me hold the baby." She looked around the vast, quiet living room, her eyes searching for a bassinet, a crib, a stroller, anything. Marcus followed her gaze, his posture stiffening as he realized the penthouse was completely silent. There was no crying. There was no soft breathing. There was no baby in the room. I sat perfectly still, holding my teacup. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the sudden unspoken realization that I was not playing their game. They had come here to claim their prize, to take ownership of my son and use him for whatever twisted, greedy scheme they had cooked up. They thought they could just walk back into my life, hand me a cashmere blanket, and erase the fact that they had left me to die. I looked at Vivian, staring directly into her frantic, searching eyes. The absolute silence of my penthouse was suddenly shattered by the sharp, piercing ring of a cell phone. Marcus jumped, startled by the sudden noise in the cavernous room. He fumbled inside his tailored suit jacket, pulling out his phone. His thumb slipped on the glass screen in his haste to silence it, but instead of declining the call, he accidentally hit the speaker button. The crisp, impatient voice of Richard Sterling, the chief legal counsel for our family real estate empire, echoed off my vaulted ceilings. "Marcus, tell me you have the paperwork signed. The board is breathing down my neck and the clock is ticking." Marcus jabbed at the screen frantically, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson, but the device froze. "If Maya does not sign that custodial proxy waiver today, we are completely out of time." The lawyer continued, his voice loud and urgent. "The moment that baby was born, the grandfather clause was triggered. You know exactly what the trust stipulates, Marcus. Control of the $200 million portfolio automatically transfers to the lineage of the first direct blood heir of the third generation. Since Jada and Trent have not produced a child, Maya's bastard son is now the sole majority shareholder. If you do not get her signature transferring his voting rights to you, you lose the chairmanship by Friday." With a violent curse, Marcus finally managed to swipe the screen, cutting the lawyer off mid-sentence. He stood there breathing heavily, the silence rushing back into the room even heavier than before. I slowly lowered my teacup to the saucer. The pieces of their sick, twisted puzzle snapped together with blinding clarity. They did not care if I lived or died last week. They only cared that I had survived just long enough to birth their golden ticket. I looked up at my father, a dark, humorless laugh escaping my throat. "So that is what this is about," I said, my voice dripping with absolute venom. "Grandpa's ironclad inheritance clause. Jada and Trent were supposed to deliver the heir. They were supposed to secure your grip on the company. But they could not do it, could they?" Vivian stepped forward, her hands twitching nervously. "Maya, please, you do not understand the complexities of corporate law." "I understand perfectly," I snapped, leaning forward. "Jada has been undergoing grueling, invasive in vitro fertilization treatments for 3 years. She has pumped her body full of hormones, cried herself to sleep, and let Trent parade around Atlanta, playing the role of the tragic, supportive husband. But it is not Jada who is infertile, is it?" Marcus and Vivian froze. "Trent is shooting blanks," I stated plainly, watching the color completely drain from my mother's face. "Your precious, perfect white son-in-law, the man you let dictate who gets to bleed on your Italian rugs, is completely sterile. He knew it, and you both knew it. But you let Jada take the blame because acknowledging Trent's failure would ruin your perfect image. You let him humiliate your own daughter behind closed doors just to keep up appearances." Marcus slammed his fist onto my glass coffee table, making Vivian's expensive baby gifts rattle. "Do not speak about things you do not comprehend," he roared, pointing a thick finger at my face. "Trent brings invaluable investor relations to this family. Jada knows her role, and you know yours. That child you just had is a legal loophole, Maya. He is a technicality that threatens everything I have built." "Everything Grandpa built," I corrected him sharply. "You just spent the last 20 years spending the profits." Marcus ignored my jab, his chest heaving with desperate anger. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents folded in thirds. He threw them onto the table next to the cashmere blankets. "You are going to sign this custodial proxy," he demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, threatening register. "You are going to grant me full executive authority over the boy's shares until he turns 25. In exchange, I will pay off the lease on this apartment, clear your medical debt, and set up a modest college fund. It is a generous offer for a woman in your precarious situation." Vivian nodded quickly, abandoning the doting grandmother act entirely. Her eyes were hard, calculating, and ruthless. "Listen to your father, Maya. You are a single black woman with no husband, no backing, and a newborn. You cannot navigate the shark-infested waters of our corporate board. Sign the paper. Let Marcus handle the business. We will make sure you have enough to live comfortably in the suburbs. Just bring the baby out, sign the waiver, and we can all move forward. A generous offer, I repeated, letting the words roll around in the air. I looked at the documents. They had even brought a pen. A heavy gold-plated Mont Blanc pen. They honestly believed I was just a desperate, penniless woman clinging to a high-rise apartment I could not afford. They honestly thought the trauma of a near-death experience had broken me enough to just hand over my son's birthright. You watched me bleed out on your dining room floor, I said, my voice eerily calm. You listened to my fetal heart monitor flatlining over the phone and told the nurses to let me figure it out. You did not want me to survive that night. You wanted the baby to survive, but you wanted me out of the way. If I had died on that operating table as the child's grandfather, you would have had an unobstructed path to claim emergency guardianship. You would have taken my son, slapped a suit on him, and paraded him around the country club as your savior while putting me in a cheap pine box. Vivian took a step back, her hand flying to her chest. That is a vile thing to say. We are your parents. You are parasites, I shot back, my eyes locking onto hers. You are parasites wearing designer clothes. You came here today thinking I was weak, bleeding, and desperate. You thought you could trade a few silver pacifiers for a $200 million empire. Marcus leaned over the table, his physical presence looming. I will not ask you again, Maya. Sign the damn paper. You do not have the power, the money, or the legal standing to fight me. If you refuse, I will drag you through family court so fast it will make your head spin. I will have you declared an unfit mother before the week is out. I will take that child from you legally, and you will get absolutely nothing. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I simply reached out and picked up my porcelain teacup, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The Earl Grey was still perfectly warm. I swallowed, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the room until Marcus's chest stopped heaving. Vivian, however, was losing her last shred of manufactured patience. She darted her eyes toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Stop playing these ridiculous games, Maya, she demanded, her voice shrill and grating. We are done negotiating. Bring the boy out here right now. Let me see my grandson. I set the teacup back onto its matching saucer with a soft, definitive clink. I looked directly into my mother's frantic, greedy eyes. Show you the baby, I repeated, tilting my head slightly, as if trying to decipher a foreign language. What baby? Vivian's jaw dropped, the color completely drained from her perfectly contoured face. What are you talking about? You gave birth. We know you gave birth. The hospital records confirmed it. I reached into the pocket of my silk robe and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was not a birth certificate. It was the official hospital incident report from the night I was admitted, heavily stamped by the attending physician and the hospital administration. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed right on top of Marcus's proxy documents. Read it carefully, I instructed, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. Marcus snatched the paper up, his eyes scanning the clinical text. Vivian leaned over his arm, her breathing shallow. That night, while I was bleeding out on an operating table, the charge nurse called you, I said, pointing a steady finger at Vivian. You were placed on speakerphone in a room full of medical professionals. The hospital records clearly state that the listed emergency contact explicitly refused to acknowledge the patient as family, refused to provide medical history, and demanded to never be contacted again. Vivian stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. You legally disowned me on a recorded hospital line. I continued, standing up slowly. I made sure the hospital social worker documented every single word you said. According to the state of Georgia, I was admitted as a Jane Doe equivalent. I gave birth as a legally independent single mother. There is no father on the birth certificate. And as of that phone call, my son officially has no grandparents. You severed the bloodline yourselves, just so you could finish eating a slice of anniversary cake. So I suggest you take your silver pacifiers and get out of my house. Marcus crushed the hospital document in his massive fist. You think a single piece of paper stops me, he growled, throwing the crumpled ball onto the floor. Blood is blood, Maya. I am the patriarch of this family. I have the best lawyers in Atlanta on retainer. A misunderstood phone call will not hold up in family court when I tell a judge that my daughter is having a mental breakdown. Before I could respond, the heavy double doors of my penthouse, which Marcus had recklessly left ajar in his furious entrance, were pushed wide open. The sound of heavy, arrogant footsteps echoed across the marble foyer. Trent strolled into my living room, looking like he had just stepped off a yacht. He was wearing a tailored navy blazer and a smug, self-satisfied grin that made my blood boil. Trailing closely behind him was Jada. My sister looked manic. Her eyes were bloodshot and darting frantically around the room, desperately searching for a crib or a baby carrier. She looked less like a poised socialite and more like a scavenger who had just caught the scent of a meal. Trent did not wait for an invitation. He walked straight past Marcus and Vivian, tossing a thick manila envelope onto my coffee table with a loud theatrical slap. "Too bad," Maya, Trent said, adjusting his expensive cuffs. "We are way past asking for your permission." I glanced down at the envelope. Across the front, printed in bold black ink, was the seal of the Fulton County Family Court. Trent shoved his hands into his pockets, standing with that unearned, arrogant posture he always utilized when trying to intimidate people he viewed as beneath him. "We just filed an ex parte motion for emergency guardianship," he announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "It turns out a single Black woman living entirely above her means showing signs of severe postpartum depression and alienating her supportive family is a massive red flag for Child Protective Services." Jada stepped forward, her voice trembling but laced with a toxic delusional superiority. "It is for the best, Maya. You have to see that. You cannot raise the heir to this family alone. You are unstable. Trent and I have a stable two-parent household. We have the resources. We can give him the life he deserves." "You mean you can use my son to cover up the fact that your husband is firing blanks?" I shot back, watching Jada flinch as if I had struck her. "You want to steal my child so you can parade him around the country club and pretend you finally fulfilled your duty to the family trust." Trent stepped in front of Jada, shielding her, playing the role of the protective, dominant male. "Watch your mouth, Maya," he snapped. "You are in no position to be making accusations. My lawyer is the best in the state. Tomorrow morning we are going before a judge. We have already submitted an affidavit claiming you lack the financial capacity to provide a safe environment for the child." He gestured broadly around my expansive living room, a mocking laugh escaping his throat. "You are clearly drowning in debt just trying to rent this place to prove a point. When the judge sees your actual bank statements, when they see you are just a low-level desk worker trying to play billionaire, they will strip you of your custody rights before noon. I am going to take that boy, Maya, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me." 72 hours later, the battlefield shifted from my penthouse to the suffocating confines of a mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Atlanta. The mediator sat at the head of the massive table, but my family had clearly already decided they were the judges, the jury, and the executioners. They sat on the opposite side of the table, presenting a united, intimidating front of generational wealth and social dominance. Vivian wore a structured pearl-white suit, looking like she was attending a charity luncheon rather than a custody dispute over her own grandson. Marcus sat beside her, his gold watch catching the overhead light, radiating the quiet, absolute authority of a man who was used to buying whatever reality he preferred. But it was Trent who immediately took control of the narrative. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, interlacing his fingers with an air of practiced corporate patience. He looked at me not as a sister-in-law, but as a hostile acquisition he was about to liquidate. "Maya, we want to keep this amicable." Trent began using that slow, measured tone. "Men like him reserve for women they believe are fundamentally less intelligent than they are. We are here because we have a moral obligation to the child. Let us look at the facts objectively. You are a single woman recovering from a traumatic medical event. You work a standard desk job. You do not have the infrastructure, the financial bandwidth, or the societal standing to raise the sole heir of this family legacy." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the table. I did not interrupt him. I let him spin his web of condescension. Trent offered a patronizing smile, leaning back slightly to let his tailored suit jacket fall perfectly into place. "I grew up with certain advantages, Maya. You know this. Jada and I have the foundation of a traditional two-parent household. We have access to the best private schools, the finest pediatricians, and a network of resources you simply cannot provide on a clerk's salary. A boy carrying the weight of this family trust needs a strong male role model. He needs a father figure who understands how the real world operates. You bringing a fatherless child into a high-pressure environment while battling postpartum instability is not just irresponsible, it is dangerous. The subtle, insidious undertone of his words hung heavily in the air. He was a wealthy white man telling a black woman that she was inherently unfit to raise her own son, leveraging every societal bias he could muster right in front of my own parents. And the most sickening part was that Marcus and Vivian nodded along in silent agreement. They were perfectly willing to let Trent strip me of my dignity if it meant securing their golden ticket. Jada took her cue flawlessly. She reached for a tissue, dabbing delicately at the corners of her eyes to ensure her expensive makeup remained perfectly intact. She let out a soft, rehearsed sob that echoed in the quiet conference room. "I just want to give him a future, Maya," Jada cried, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "Trent and I have so much love to give. We have the beautiful nursery ready. We have the stability he desperately needs right now. We are not trying to erase you. You can still be his aunt. You can visit him on holidays. But you have to admit you are drowning. You were bleeding on the floor just a week ago. How can you possibly protect a newborn when you cannot even protect yourself?" She reached across the table, her hand hovering as if she wanted to comfort me, though she made sure not to actually touch me. "Please, Maya. Do the right thing. Surrender custody. Let us raise him the way he deserves to be raised. Let us give him the life you never could." The mediator looked between us, her expression carefully neutral, but clearly swayed by the theatrical display of wealth and concern radiating from my family. They had painted the perfect picture. The stable, affluent married couple stepping in to save an innocent child from a reckless, destitute single mother. They had crafted a narrative designed to crush me under the weight of my own supposed inadequacy. Vivian chimed in, her voice dripping with maternal disappointment. "Listen to your sister Maya. We are offering you a clean slate. Sign the guardianship papers today, and we will ensure your medical bills from that unfortunate night are completely paid off. We will even give you a small monthly stipend to help you get back on your feet. Do not force us to drag your mental health records into a public courtroom. Do not force us to humiliate you." I looked at the four of them. I looked at Trent's arrogant smirk, at Jada's fake tears, at Vivian's cold calculation, and at Marcus's silent looming threat. They honestly believed they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was a terrified low-level employee, terrified of their wealth and power. They thought their expensive suits and country club memberships made them invincible. I did not cry. I did not yell. I took a deep, steadying breath and let a calm, razor-sharp smile touch my lips. I turned my gaze directly to the mediator, my voice clear and ringing with absolute authority. "I appreciate the concern my family is showing for my financial and mental well-being. However, their entire argument is based on a profound and rather embarrassing misunderstanding of my actual circumstances." I reached down to the leather briefcase resting beside my chair. The heavy thud of the thick-bound document hitting the mahogany table shattered the suffocating tension in the room. I slid the pristine gold-embossed financial portfolio precisely to the center of the table. Trent frowned, his confident posture slipping just a fraction. "What is this, Maya? More hospital bills you want us to pay?" I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on the mediator. "My family seems to be under the impression that I work a low-level desk job. They believe I am financially incapable of providing for my son. I would like to formally submit my independent financial audit and proof of assets to the record." I opened the portfolio, flipping to the verified summary page. "I am not a clerk, Trent. For the past 7 years, while you were busy playing golf and spending my sister's trust fund, I built my own firm from the ground up. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital Partners. I currently manage a private equity portfolio valued at over $500 million. The color drained from Trent's face instantly. Jada's fake tears vanished, replaced by wide-eyed, uncomprehending shock. Marcus leaned forward, staring at the financial seal on the document, as if it were a venomous snake. Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "That is impossible. You live in a rented apartment. You drive a standard car. You never said a word about any of this." I turned my sharp gaze to my mother. I live in the penthouse of a luxury high-rise Vivian, a high-rise that my holding company purchased outright 2 years ago. I own the building you tried to kick me out of. I drive a standard car because I do not need to flaunt my wealth to feel validated, unlike the people sitting across from me. I did not tell you about my success because I knew exactly what you would do. You would try to control it just like you try to control everything else. I looked back at Trent, who was staring at the verified bank statements with a look of pure, unadulterated panic. His entire narrative of superiority was crumbling to ash right in front of him. You talked a lot about infrastructure and resources, Trent. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. You talked about providing a stable environment. But since we are laying all our cards on the table, let us talk about your definition of stability. Let us talk about what you consider a proper foundation for raising my son. I reached back into my briefcase. The time for playing defense was over. It was time to go on the offensive. I pulled out a second stack of papers. These were not bound in leather. They were raw, messy, and devastating. I tossed them onto the table, letting the glossy photographs and highlighted bank statements spread out across the polished wood right in front of Jada. What is this? Jada whispered, her voice trembling as she looked down at a photograph of Trent walking into a suburban house in Florida with a blonde woman and 2 young children. That, I said, leaning forward so Trent could see the absolute ruin in my eyes, is Trent's real foundation. I tapped a manicured fingernail against a highlighted bank transfer. You said you had a better background, Trent. Is that why you have been secretly siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from Jada's corporate accounts to pay off your massive offshore gambling debts? Or is the better background the secret second family you have been supporting in Miami for the last 4 years? 2 children, Trent. 2 children you have been hiding while letting my sister destroy her body with fertility treatments because you were too much of a coward to admit you were the problem. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world shattering. Jada let out a guttural, horrifying sound, a sound of pure betrayal and agony, as she grabbed the photographs. She stared at the images of her husband holding another woman's children, the date stamps proving he had been visiting them on the very weekends he claimed to be away on business trips for their family company. Trent. Jada choked out her hands, shaking so violently she dropped the papers. Trent, tell me this is a lie. Tell me she manufactured this. Trent was entirely speechless. The arrogant, mansplaining executive, who had just tried to strip me of my motherhood, was sweating profusely, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. He looked at Marcus silently, begging for the patriarch to intervene, but Marcus was staring at the bank statements proving Trent had been stealing directly from the family business. You fraudulent, miserable parasite, Marcus roared, his face turning an explosive shade of purple. He lunged across his chair, grabbing Trent by the collar of his expensive, bespoke suit. You have been stealing from my company. You have been humiliating my daughter. Jada began to scream, shoving Trent's hands away as he tried to reach for her. Do not touch me. You let me inject myself with hormones for years. You let me think I was broken. The carefully constructed elite image of their perfect family was being ripped apart from the inside out. They were screaming, cursing, and tearing each other down right in front of the mediator, who was watching the scene unfold with wide, stunned eyes. I sat back in my chair, perfectly calm, watching the chaos I had unleashed. They had wanted a war over my son. They had wanted to use my child as a pawn in their greedy corporate games. But they had brought a knife to a nuclear fight. Marcus suddenly released Trent, shoving him backward into his chair. The patriarch turned his furious, bloodshot eyes toward me. His breathing was heavy, his chest heaving with rage as he tried to salvage the last scraps of his authority. This changes nothing about the company, Maya, Marcus bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at me over the table. You might have your own money, and this worthless excuse for a man might be finished, but I am still the chairman of the family enterprise. That baby is still the key to the grandfather clause. I will call an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. I will use every ounce of executive power I have to freeze your assets, block your voting rights, and legally isolate you from this family trust. I will burn the entire board down before I let you take control of my empire. The room fell silent again, the raw threat hanging heavily in the air. Jada was sobbing into her hands. Trent was staring at the floor, ruined. Marcus stood tall, panting, trying to look invincible. I looked at my father, feeling a deep, profound sense of pity for the man who was about to lose absolutely everything. I tilted my head, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "Are you absolutely sure about that, Dad?" The mediator adjusted her glasses, her expression tightening with professional concern as she looked across the polished mahogany table. She had absorbed every word of Trent's patronizing speech and Jada's theatrical sobbing. The room was thick with the suffocating weight of my family's manufactured narrative. Miss Williams, the mediator, began, her tone gentle, but carrying a distinct note of pity. "Your sister and brother-in-law have raised significant concerns regarding your financial bandwidth. They have presented a compelling argument about their established household, their generational wealth, and your current position. Given the medical debts mentioned, and your supposed employment as a low-level clerk, how exactly do you intend to provide the exceptional level of care and stability this child requires?" A heavy, triumphant silence settled over my family's side of the table. Jada dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the heartbroken aunt to absolute perfection. Vivian sat up straighter, adjusting the lapels of her pearl-white suit, practically glowing with the satisfaction of watching me be publicly humiliated. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, his face set in a hard scowl of patriarchal authority. And Trent just leaned back in his leather chair, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He truly believed he had just checkmated me. He thought his white male privilege and his stolen corporate title had effortlessly crushed the single black woman sitting across from him. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I simply reached for the crystal glass in front of me and took a slow, deliberate sip of water. I set the glass down with a soft clink that echoed in the quiet room. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, predatory grin of someone who had just locked the doors to a cage. "I completely agree with Trent on one specific point," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute icy clarity. "A child carrying the legacy of this family requires an ironclad foundation. They require a parent who understands exactly how the real world operates. But the foundation Trent is bragging about is built entirely on sand, and the financial reality he just presented to this room is nothing but an embarrassing, desperate fiction." Trent scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes. "Maya, please do not make this harder than it has to be. The mediator does not want to hear your delusions of grandeur." Right on cue, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open. The sudden noise made Vivian jump in her seat. A woman stepped into the room. It was not an assistant or a paralegal. It was Ms. Crawford, one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate litigators in the entire state of Georgia. She wore an impeccable charcoal suit, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with terrifying authority. Ms. Crawford did not offer greetings. She walked directly to my side of the table, opened her leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick, sealed document bound in heavy cardstock. She placed it squarely in the center of the table, right in front of the mediator. "I apologize for the interruption," Ms. Crawford said, her tone devoid of any warmth. "I am lead counsel for my client's corporate holding company. Per Miss Williams' instructions, I am submitting the independent third-party financial audit of her personal and corporate assets, certified as of yesterday morning." The mediator frowned, pulling the heavy document toward her. Trent leaned forward, his smug grin faltering slightly as his eyes darted from the high-powered attorney back to me. "Trent, you spent the last 20 minutes mansplaining my own life to me," I said, leaning forward to match his posture. "You stood in my living room last week and called me a low-level desk worker trying to play billionaire. You told this mediator I was a destitute clerk drowning in medical debt. Let us look at the actual numbers." The mediator broke the seal on the document and flipped open the cover page. Her eyes scanned the first paragraph, and I watched the color completely drain from her face. She blinked rapidly, her gaze snapping up to look at me with profound shock. "Read it out loud," I commanded softly. "For my family, they seem to be operating under outdated information." The mediator cleared her throat, her voice suddenly shaking. "This is a verified asset declaration for Maya Williams. She is listed as the sole founder, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer of Apex Capital Partners." The name of the firm hit the room like a physical shockwave. Apex Capital Partners was a shadow titan in the Atlanta financial district. It was known for ruthless acquisitions, massive commercial real estate buyouts and funding, some of the most lucrative tech startups in the South. Trent literally gasped. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "That is a lie," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Apex Capital is managed by a private trust. The CEO is completely anonymous. I am the trust, Trent." I shot back, my voice cutting through his panic like a blade. "I built that firm from the ground up 7 years ago while you were busy playing golf and pretending to be a finance guru on my sister's dime. I manage a private equity portfolio valued at over $500 million. I do not file paperwork. I own the people who buy the companies that file the paperwork." Jada let out a strangled, breathless sound. She turned to look at Trent, desperately seeking reassurance, but Trent was staring at the audit report with wide, terrified eyes. His finance background meant he knew exactly what he was looking at. He recognized the official seals, the banking watermarks, the sheer, undeniable magnitude of the wealth sitting on the table. Vivian shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair trembling. "No, no, this is some sort of trick. Maya, you drive a standard sedan. You wear simple clothes. You have always been plain. If you had this kind of money, you would have shown it. You would have bought designer bags. You would have joined the country club." I looked at my mother with deep, unadulterated pity. Stealth wealth is a concept people with loud insecurities will never understand, Vivian. I did not need to buy a $10,000 handbag to prove my worth to a room full of hypocrites. I kept my money quiet because I knew exactly who you people were. I knew the second you smelled wealth, you would try to control it. You would try to manipulate me just like you manipulated Jada. I chose peace over your toxic approval. Marcus was gripping the armrests of his chair. The veins in his neck were bulging. He was the patriarch, the man who demanded complete financial submission from his children. Realizing that the daughter he had constantly degraded was actually worth more than his entire inherited real estate empire was breaking his brain in real time. "You rent a penthouse," Marcus suddenly shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are burning cash on a luxury lease. You do not own anything tangible." I let out a dark, melodic laugh that chilled the room. "I was waiting for you to bring that up, Dad." I nodded to Ms. Crawford. She pulled a single crisp deed of ownership from her folder and slid it directly over to Marcus. "I do not rent the penthouse," I stated plainly, watching Marcus stare down at the legal document. "I never had a lease. My holding company purchased that entire 50-story residential tower 2 years ago in a cash buyout. The building you barged into last week. The building where you threatened to declare me an unfit mother. I own every single brick of it. I am your landlord, Marcus. I own the ground you stood on when you threatened to take my son." The absolute destruction of their superiority complex was beautiful to witness. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift, it inverted violently. My family was entirely speechless. Jada's fake tears had dried up, instantly replaced by a hollow, terrified realization that she was no longer the most successful daughter. Vivian was clutching her chest, physically struggling to process that the scapegoat of the family was actually a half-billionaire titan. And Trent. Trent looked like he was about to vomit. The arrogant white savior who thought he could stroll into a mediation room and legally execute my motherhood was now realizing he was outmatched, outclassed, and outgunned by an astronomical margin. "You talked a lot about providing a safe environment, Trent." I continued, not letting them breathe for a single second. "You sat there and tried to weaponize my trauma. You tried to use the night my parents left me to die on a dining room floor as proof that I was unstable. But you have no idea what instability really looks like. You have no idea what a dangerous foundation actually is." I stood up slowly, picking up my leather briefcase. I placed it on the table and popped the golden latches. The sharp clicks echoed like gunshots. "You brought up your pristine background, Trent. You told this mediator that you and Jada had the perfect traditional household to raise the heir of this family. So let us look at your background. Let us look at what you are actually bringing to the table." I reached into my briefcase one final time. My eyes locked onto Trent, and I let all the suppressed rage of the past month focus into a single razor-sharp glare. "You said you have a better foundation, Trent. You sat in my house and told me you had the proper traditional background to raise my son. Let us look at what your foundation is actually built on. I pulled a thick manila envelope from my bag and slammed it onto the mahogany table. I did not slide it to the mediator. I shoved it directly across the polished wood until it hit Trent's folded hands. The flap opened, spilling a chaotic mess of glossy photographs, highlighted bank statements, and legal background checks. Jada leaned forward, her brow furrowed in confusion. Her perfectly manicured hand reached out and picked up the top photograph. I watched the exact second her perfect curated world violently shattered. The color drained from Jada's face so fast, she looked like she might pass out. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was staring at a high-definition photograph of her husband, the man who had just preached about traditional family values, walking out of a suburban house in Miami. He was holding the hand of a blonde woman and carrying a toddler on his shoulders. A second slightly older child was clinging to his leg. "What is this?" Jada whispered, her voice a fragile, trembling thread. "Trent, what is this?" Trent lunged forward, desperately trying to snatch the photographs out of her hands. "Jada, do not look at that. It is a setup. She manufactured these. It is a lie. I did not manufacture the offshore bank accounts." I stated, my voice echoing through the silent conference room with the force of a gavel. "Look at the highlighted statements beneath the photos, Jada. Look at the routing numbers. For the past 4 years, your pristine, financially brilliant husband has been systematically siphoning money out of your personal trust fund and the family real estate development accounts. He has been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars through shell companies just to pay off his massive, crippling sports gambling debts." Vivian gasped, pressing her hand against her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Marcus froze, his eyes darting to the bank statements. "But that is not the worst part." I continued, keeping my eyes fixed directly on my sister. "The worst part is the Florida accounts. You spent the last 3 years destroying your body with invasive in vitro fertilization treatments. You pumped yourself full of hormones. You cried yourself to sleep every time a test came back negative. You thought you were broken. You thought you were the reason you two could not give Dad his precious heir. But Trent is not infertile, Jada. He never was. He just did not want to have a child with you. He already has a family in Florida. He has been fully supporting them with your money, while letting you take the blame for the infertility." Jada let out a sound that I will never forget. It was a guttural, agonizing scream of pure betrayal. She dropped the photographs as if they were burning her skin. She shoved her chair back so violently it crashed into the wall behind her. "You let me think it was my fault!" Jada shrieked, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her face, ruining her flawless makeup. "You held my hand in those clinics. You watched me suffer. And you had 2 children with another woman. You stole my money to feed them." Trent was sweating profusely. The arrogant, condescending executive from 10 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place was a cornered, pathetic fraud. "Jada, baby, please listen to me," he stammered, raising his hands in a desperate gesture of surrender. "The gambling got out of control, yes, but the money was just a loan. I was going to put it back. And the woman in Florida, it meant nothing. It was before we got married. I just had to take care of the kids. You have to believe me." "Do not touch me!" Jada screamed, batting his hands away as he tried to reach for her. "You are a monster. You are a disgusting, lying parasite." Vivian immediately shifted into damage control mode. Her instinct to protect the family image overrode any maternal sympathy for her devastated daughter. "Jada, lower your voice," Vivian hissed, glancing nervously at the mediator, who was sitting in absolute wide-eyed shock. "We can handle this quietly. We will call the lawyers. We will manage the narrative. Do not make a scene in front of these people." I watched my mother prioritize a public relations strategy over her own daughter's shattered heart. It was sickening, but it was exactly who she was. Marcus, however, was not concerned with public relations. He was staring at the bank statements proving that Trent had stolen from his family empire. The patriarch's face turned a dangerous, explosive shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk tie. "You stole from my company," Marcus roared. His voice was a thunderclap that shook the room. He slammed his massive fists onto the table, causing the crystal water glasses to rattle. "You walked into my house, drank my liquor, married my daughter, and you stole my money. I will see you rot in a federal prison, Trent. I will personally tear your life apart piece by piece. Trent shrank back in his chair, completely terrified. But Marcus was a man who needed absolute control, and right now the entire room had slipped from his grasp. He realized that I was the one who had orchestrated this destruction. I was the one who had uncovered the theft. I was the one who held all the power. And his massive, fragile ego simply could not handle being upstaged by the daughter he had always considered a failure. Marcus turned his furious, bloodshot eyes away from Trent and locked them onto me. His chest heaved with heavy, aggressive breaths. He was trying to reassert his dominance, trying to remind everyone in the room that he was the ultimate authority. "You think this changes anything?" Marcus bellowed, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger at my face. "You think because you hired some private investigators and hid some money in a private equity firm that you can walk in here and humiliate me. You think you have won." I sat perfectly still, completely unfazed by his temper tantrum. "I did not win, Dad. I just exposed the truth." "I do not care about your truth." Marcus spat, leaning entirely over the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You are still a disrespectful, disobedient child. You might have your own little investment fund, but I am still the chairman of the family real estate empire. I built this legacy. I control the board. I control the trusts. You brought a bastard child into this world and refused to bend to my rules. You think you can keep the boy away from me? I will crush you." He slammed his hand on the table again, spittle flying from his lips. "I will call an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. I will use every ounce of executive privilege I possess to freeze you out completely. I will sever your ties to the family name. I will block any residual rights you think you have, and I will drag you through the mud until you beg me for mercy. I am the king of this family, Maya, and I will erase you from the history of this empire." The room went dead silent. Jada's sobbing hitched in her throat. Vivian looked at her husband with fearful reverence. Trent stared at the table, a broken man. They all waited for me to break. They waited for the little girl who had always been pushed aside to finally bow her head and submit to the terrifying wrath of the patriarch. I slowly closed my leather briefcase and fastened the gold clasps. The metallic click sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. I looked up at my father, meeting his furious, bulging eyes with an expression of pure, unadulterated calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I simply let a cold, mocking smile spread across my face. "Are you sure about that, Dad?" Less than 12 hours later, the battlefield shifted to the top floor of the Williams Group corporate headquarters. The boardroom was a sprawling monument to my father's fragile ego. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, a city my family had helped develop and profit from for 3 generations. The massive custom-built mahogany table anchored the room, surrounded by high-back leather chairs that felt more like thrones than office furniture. I walked through the heavy glass doors precisely 1 minute before the meeting was scheduled to begin. I did not come alone. I pushed a sleek, matte black bassinet stroller, containing my newborn son who was sleeping peacefully, completely oblivious to the corporate warfare about to take place. Flanking my right side was Ms. Crawford, my lead corporate litigator, carrying a single leather briefcase. The scene waiting for me inside the boardroom was a masterclass in toxic delusion. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his face set in a mask of absolute patriarchal authority. Vivian sat to his immediate right, dressed in a sharp navy blue power suit, sipping sparkling water, as if the previous night's revelations had never occurred. She was the ultimate enabler, a woman who would gladly watch her daughters burn to the ground, as long as the ashes did not smudge her pristine social reputation. But the most pathetic sight in the room was sitting across from my parents. Jada and Trent were seated next to each other. There was a visible icy foot of space between their chairs. But the fact that they were sitting together at all told me everything I needed to know. Jada's eyes were swollen and rimmed with red despite the heavy layer of expensive concealer she had applied to hide her devastation. She had seen the undeniable proof of Trent's secret family in Miami. She knew her husband had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from her trust fund to pay off his gambling debts and support his hidden children. Yet she had chosen to stay by his side. She was so deeply addicted to her status, so terrified of the public humiliation of a divorce, that she chose to blindly cling to a fraudulent marriage rather than face the truth. Trent looked like a man standing on the gallows. His face was pale, and he was sweating through his designer shirt. He knew his only chance of avoiding federal prison for embezzlement was to stay in Marcus's good graces. He had clearly spent the entire night begging for his life, promising his absolute loyalty to my father in exchange for protection. They had formed a desperate, unholy alliance built purely on greed and the mutual desire to destroy me. Marcus slammed his wooden gavel onto the table, the sharp crack echoing through the large room. He glared at me, then pointed a thick finger at the stroller. "Get that child out of this boardroom immediately," Marcus barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "This is an executive shareholder meeting, not a daycare center. Have your assistant take him to the lobby. You are already on thin ice, Maya. Do not push your luck." I did not stop walking until I reached the opposite end of the long table. I parked the stroller, carefully locking the wheels, and took my seat directly facing my father. "My son stays right where he is," I replied, my voice cool and perfectly level. "He has as much of a right to be in this room as anyone else sitting at this table. In fact, considering the agenda you drafted for this morning, his presence is absolutely mandatory." Marcus sneered, opening a thick leather binder in front of him. "You have no rights left to dictate anything in this building. I am calling this emergency session of the Williams Group Board of Directors to order. Let the record reflect that the 4 majority voting shareholders are present. Myself, Vivian, Jada, and Trent, acting as Jada's proxy. Combined, we represent 60% of the voting shares of this enterprise." He looked up, his eyes burning with malicious triumph. He genuinely believed he held the executioner's axe. "The sole item on the docket today is the immediate termination of Maya Williams from the board of directors and the revocation of all her executive privileges within the family trust," Marcus announced loudly. "The grounds for termination are conduct detrimental to the family name, gross insubordination, and severe moral turpitude." Ms. Crawford stood perfectly still beside me, her face a mask of professional indifference. I simply leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. "Moral turpitude," I repeated, allowing a dry, mocking laugh to escape my lips. "That is a fascinating choice of words, Dad. You are attempting to oust me for moral failings, while sitting at the same table as a man who embezzled corporate funds to support a secret second family." Jada slammed her hand onto the mahogany table. Her voice shook thin and shrill with desperation. "Do not speak to my husband that way, Maya. You do not know anything about our marriage. You forged those bank statements. You manufactured those photographs just to try and tear us apart, because you are a bitter, lonely single mother who cannot stand to see anyone else happy." I looked at my younger sister with profound, overwhelming pity. She was actually doubling down. She had chosen to embrace the lie because the truth was too heavy for her fragile ego to carry. She would rather destroy her own sister than admit the golden boy she married was a parasite. "You are living in a delusion, Jada," I said softly. "You are protecting a man who has been robbing you blind because you are too scared of what the other women at the country club will say if you leave him." Trent sat up straighter, emboldened by his wife's blind loyalty and my father's backing. He adjusted his tie, trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. "We are not here to discuss my personal life, Maya. We are here to discuss your blatant conflict of interest. You hid your ownership of a massive private equity firm from this board. You have been operating Apex Capital Partners in secret, which is a direct violation of your fiduciary duty to the Williams Group. You are a rogue agent, and you are a liability to this family's legacy." Vivian nodded vigorously in agreement, glaring at me from across the room. "You have brought nothing but shame and chaos into our lives, Maya. You disrespected your father. You humiliated us. You think your secret money makes you invincible, but it only proves how deceitful you really are. We are purifying this family today. We are cutting out the cancer." They had rehearsed this. They had spent the entire night mapping out their attack, convincing themselves that they were the victims, and I was the villain. They were using their combined 60% voting bloc as a weapon to strip me of my inheritance, to freeze me out of the company my grandfather had built, and to punish me for daring to be successful without their permission. Marcus raised his gavel again. The time for discussion is over. The bylaws are clear. A majority vote is all that is required to remove a board member for cause. I am calling for an immediate vote on the resolution to terminate Maya Williams and seize her remaining shares for redistribution to the trust. He looked around the table, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. All those in favor of the resolution, raise your hand. Marcus raised his right hand high into the air. Vivian immediately raised hers, a smug, satisfied smile stretching across her perfectly made-up face. Trent raised his hand without a second's hesitation, desperate to secure his salvation. Jada looked at me for one brief, fleeting moment. I saw the guilt flash in her eyes, followed instantly by the cold, hard prioritization of her own status. She raised her hand. "The vote is unanimous among the majority bloc," Marcus declared, slamming the gavel down with a resounding crack that signaled my supposed execution. 60% of the voting shares have spoken. The motion carries. You are officially removed from the Williams Group Maya. Your access to the corporate accounts is frozen effective immediately. Your security clearance is revoked. Leave your keycard on the table and have your lawyers escort you out of my building. They all exhaled collectively. Trent visibly relaxed in his chair, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Jada lifted her chin, looking down her nose at me. Vivian reached over and patted Marcus on the arm, celebrating their ruthless victory. They thought the war was over. They thought they had successfully pushed me out into the cold. I did not move. I did not reach for my keycard. I simply turned my head and looked down into the stroller, where my newborn son was sleeping peacefully. I gently adjusted the soft blanket covering him, ensuring he was comfortable. Then I turned my attention back to the four people sitting across the table who had just tried to erase my existence. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood. I looked at Marcus, letting a slow, terrifying smile break across my face. "You keep throwing that number around, Dad," I said, my voice echoing with deadly calm. 60%. You are incredibly confident in your math. But there is a massive fatal flaw in your calculation. You do not actually own 60% of the voting shares. In fact, as of yesterday evening, you do not even own enough shares to call this meeting to order. Marcus let out a bark of laughter that echoed off the high glass walls of the boardroom. It was a harsh, desperate sound. "You have lost your mind, Maya. I hold 40% of the voting shares personally. Your mother holds 10. Your sister holds 10. You have 0. That is 60% of the company right there. You cannot just invent shares out of thin air to save yourself." Ms. Crawford did not even blink. She reached into her leather briefcase and withdrew a sealed archival envelope bearing the gold crest of the original law firm my grandfather had founded decades ago. She placed it on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. "My grandfather was a visionary," I said, keeping my eyes locked on my father. "He built this real estate empire from a single storefront in South Atlanta. He knew the value of hard work. And more importantly, he knew exactly who you were, Marcus. He knew you cared more about expensive suits and country club memberships than the actual business. He saw you making reckless deals in the 90s. He knew you were quietly siphoning profits to fund your extravagant lifestyle." Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "Do not speak about my father that way. I am the sole executor of his estate. I read the will 20 years ago." "You read the decoy trust," I corrected him, a sharp smile touching my lips. "You read the temporary operating agreement he set up just to keep the lights on while he waited for a worthy successor. You never read the shadow charter." Ms. Crawford broke the thick red wax seal on the envelope. She pulled out a yellowed document typed on heavy bond paper. The original signatures of my grandfather and a federal judge were clearly visible at the bottom. "Let me educate you on the grandfather clause," Ms. Crawford said, her voice commanding the entire room. "Your father placed 70% of the actual controlling shares of this enterprise into an invisible holding trust. He deliberately structured the company so that you, Marcus, were only operating with 30% of the total equity divided among you, your wife, and your daughter. You thought you owned the whole pie, but you have only been managing the crust." Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her pearl necklace. "That is impossible. The auditors would have seen it." "The auditors saw exactly what my grandfather paid them to see," I replied smoothly. He hid the real power because he knew Marcus would eventually bankrupt this family. He needed a fail-safe. So he tied the release of that 70% shadow trust to one specific undeniable event: the birth of the first direct biological heir of the third generation. Trent suddenly leaned forward, panic flashing in his eyes, as his finance background caught up with the legal jargon. "Wait," Trent stammered, looking at Jada and then at me. "The proxy. The custodial proxy." "Exactly," Trent, I said, giving him a cold nod. "For 3 years you let my sister destroy her body with fertility drugs, because you both knew the first baby born would trigger the ultimate payout. You wanted that child so you could act as the legal guardian and seize the 70% trust. You wanted to rule the empire, but your plan failed because you are entirely sterile. You could not produce the heir. I did." Marcus was turning a dangerous shade of purple. He pointed a trembling finger at the stroller. "Then the boy owns the shares. And as the patriarch of this family, I am his legal guardian in matters of the corporate estate. The proxy defaults to me. I am still the chairman." Ms. Crawford did not even look at him. She simply read from the yellow document in her hands, paragraph 4 subsection B of the Master Charter. "Upon the birth of the qualifying heir, the 70% controlling trust shall be immediately activated. However, to protect the child from predatory family members or corporate mismanagement, voting rights and executive control shall not be held by any existing board member." Ms. Crawford paused, letting the silence wrap around their throats like a noose. "Total and absolute executive control," Ms. Crawford continued, her voice ringing like a bell, "shall be granted immediately and irrevocably to the biological mother who gave birth to the heir. She shall retain unchecked supreme authority over the entire enterprise until the child reaches 25 years of age." The boardroom felt like the air had been sucked out of a vacuum. Jada let out a strangled sob, covering her face with her hands. The reality was finally crashing down on her. The sister she had mocked, the sister she had watched bleed on her dining room floor, was now the supreme ruler of their entire existence. Vivian started shaking. Her pristine power suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. "Maya," she whispered, her voice cracking with terror. "You own 70%. I own 70% of the holding company." I corrected her, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Which means I control the board. I control the assets. I control the bank accounts. I own the building we are sitting in. I own the house you live in. You are a minority shareholder in my kingdom now, Mother." Trent jumped out of his chair. His white privilege and corporate arrogance were completely shattered. He pointed wildly at the document. "This is a fraud. You cannot just walk in here with a 20-year-old piece of paper and take over a multinational real estate firm. We will challenge this in federal court. I know judges. I know people who will rip this document to shreds." Ms. Crawford slowly turned her gaze to Trent. I loved the way she looked at him like he was a stain on the bottom of her shoe. "Mr. Trent, you are currently under investigation for embezzling corporate funds to support a secret second family in Florida. I strongly suggest you sit down and remain silent unless you would like me to call the Federal White-Collar Crime Division right this second. I have the speed dial ready." Trent collapsed back into his leather chair, totally defeated. He buried his face in his hands, realizing his entire life was over. He had no money, no leverage, and a very real threat of federal prison hanging over his head. Marcus was hyperventilating. The great patriarch, the man who had demanded respect and obedience through fear and financial manipulation, was completely broken. He grabbed the edges of the mahogany table, trying to hoist himself up, but his legs seemed to lack the strength. "You cannot do this to me," Marcus gasped, his voice sounding thin and weak. "I am your father. I gave you life. I built this company into what it is today. You are going to steal my legacy over a technicality." "Yao built nothing," Dad, I said, standing up from my chair. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor as I walked slowly around the table, savoring every single step. "You spent decades playing the big man, throwing lavish parties, importing Italian rugs, and looking down on everyone around you. You used my sister as a prop. You let Trent steal from us because you were too arrogant to actually check the accounting ledgers. And when I was dying on your floor, begging for help to save my child, you told me I was a humiliation. I stopped right behind his chair. I leaned down, bringing my face close to his ear so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. I am not stealing your legacy, Dad. I am reclaiming my grandfather's legacy from a thief. Vivian stood up abruptly, tears streaming down her face. She reached her hands out toward me, a pathetic attempt to play the loving mother. Maya, baby, please. We were wrong. We made a terrible mistake. But we are family. We can run this together. You are a new mother. You need help. Let us help you. We can be a family again. I looked at the woman who had cared more about her designer shoes than my life. I looked at the hands that had thrown a napkin at me instead of calling an ambulance. Do not ever call me your baby again, I commanded. My voice was ice cold, freezing any remaining hope she had of manipulating me. You made your choice when you hung up the phone on that emergency room nurse. You told her to let me figure it out, so I figured it out. I just figured it out with a team of corporate lawyers and a $500 million private equity firm backing me up. I walked back to the stroller. My son shifted slightly in his sleep, a soft, perfect breath escaping his tiny lips. I placed my hand gently on the edge of the bassinet, feeling the fierce protective instinct that had driven me to survive that night. I looked up at the four broken people sitting at the table. They were nothing but ghosts now, relics of a toxic past I was officially leaving behind. As the newly recognized majority shareholder holding 70% of the voting power, I am calling this board of directors to order, I announced. My voice sliced through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. Marcus tried to stand, perhaps to physically intimidate me, as he had done for my entire life, but his legs simply gave out. He slumped back into his oversized leather chair, a defeated empty shell of the tyrant who had terrorized our family. He stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, unable to comprehend that his reign was officially over. Vivian suddenly shrieked, the sound echoing sharply off the glass walls. You cannot do this to us. We will sue you. We will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. I will personally call the board of the Jack and Jill chapter and every country club in Atlanta. I will see to it that you never show your face in high society again. You will not see a dime of that money. You have no money left to sue me with, Vivian, I replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with my mother. You traded your power for the illusion of control, and now you have neither. I turned my attention to the attorney standing faithfully by my side. Ms. Crawford, please proceed with my first official acts as the chairwoman of the Williams Group. Ms. Crawford opened her leather folder with terrifying precision. She did not look at my parents with pity or respect. She looked at them the way a tax collector looks at a defaulted account. Item 1, I declared, shifting my gaze directly to my father. Marcus Williams is hereby terminated from his position as Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board, effective immediately. The grounds for your termination are gross financial misconduct, reliction of fiduciary duty, and systematic embezzlement of corporate funds. Security has already been notified. You will be escorted to your office to pack a single box of personal items. You have exactly 15 minutes before your corporate access badge is permanently deactivated and you are escorted off my property. Marcus opened his mouth, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. The patriarch who had built his identity on demanding absolute obedience was entirely speechless, choking on his own ruin. Item 2, I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. I turned my gaze to my younger sister. Jada was shaking violently in her chair, clutching the fabric of her emerald gown as if it could protect her from the storm I was unleashing. Jada Williams is indefinitely suspended from her position as Vice President of Public Relations. Your corporate credit cards have already been canceled. Your company vehicle will be repossessed from the parking garage by noon today. You are no longer authorized to speak on behalf of this enterprise, and your salary is officially frozen. Jada let out a loud, pathetic wail. The golden child, the woman who had smirked while I bled on the floor, was finally experiencing the real world. She reached out to Trent, grabbing his tailored sleeve with trembling hands. Trent, do something. Jada sobbed, her flawless makeup running down her face. Tell them they cannot do this to us. We have rights. Tell them to stop. But Trent was paralyzed. He was staring at the polished mahogany table as if it were a trapdoor about to drop him into a pit of fire. Item 3. I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register as I locked eyes with my brother-in-law. The Williams Group is immediately halting all capital funding, pulling all investments, and severing all financial ties with Trent's real estate development firm. We are initiating a forensic audit of every single dime you funneled into your ghost projects and offshore accounts over the past 4 years. Ms. Crawford will be handing those findings directly over to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation by the end of the business day. Trent stopped breathing. His pristine, arrogant finance executive persona completely evaporated into thin air. He was looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary, total bankruptcy, and the complete destruction of his fabricated life. You people threw me out into the cold, I said, standing up and straightening my silk blouse. You thought you could strip me of my dignity, ignore my medical emergency, and steal my child through the courts. You thought I was weak. But you just handed me the keys to the castle. You officially lose everything. The gravity of my words finally broke the remaining fragments of their sanity. Driven by pure, unadulterated panic, Trent snapped. The man who had spent the last 3 years playing the role of the devoted, supportive white husband suddenly turned on his wife like a cornered rabid animal. Trent violently ripped his arm out of Jada's grip, pushing her back so hard her heavy leather chair nearly tipped over. "Get your hands off me!" Trent roared, his face contorting into a mask of pure hatred and desperation. "This is your fault. All of this is your fault." Jada stared at him, her tear-streaked face frozen in absolute horror. "Trent, what are you talking about?" Jada pleaded, holding her hands up defensively. "We are a team. We can fight this together. We can hire our own lawyers." "There is no team!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking loudly. He pointed a shaking finger right in her face, ignoring the fact that her parents were sitting just feet away. "I spent years playing the perfect husband to a spoiled, useless brat just so I could secure that inheritance. I put up with your constant whining, your pathetic obsession with country club gossip, and your endless need for attention because you were supposed to deliver the heir. You had one job, Jada. One single job. Give birth to a baby so we could take the grandfather trust and secure the payout. And you could not even do that right." The entire boardroom seemed to hold its breath. Jada's mouth hung open, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The man she had defended just yesterday, the man she had chosen over her own sister, was publicly shredding her to pieces. "You are useless." Trent spat, stepping away from her in absolute disgust. "You could not give me a child, and you could not even keep your own family money. I am financially ruined because I tied myself to a failure." Jada looked like she had been physically struck. She turned her desperate, pleading eyes toward our parents. She had been the golden child her entire life. She had always been protected, praised, and insulated from the consequences of the real world. She fully expected Vivian and Marcus to rise from their chairs, defend her honor, and destroy the man who was screaming at her. "Mom." Jada cried out, her voice a fragile, broken plea. "Mom, please do something. Tell him to stop. Help me." Vivian stood up. Her face was pale, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled from the stress of the past hour. She walked slowly around the large mahogany table toward her favorite daughter. Jada reached her hands out, expecting a warm maternal embrace, expecting the fierce protection Vivian had always denied me. Instead, Vivian raised her right hand and slapped Jada across the face with such terrifying force that the sharp crack echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. Jada gasped, clutching her stinging red cheek. Her eyes were wide with unimaginable betrayal. "Do not look at me for help," Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic, selfish rage. The pristine facade of the loving high society mother was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered narcissist. "Trent is absolutely right. You had every advantage in the world. You had the best doctors, the best fertility clinics, all the money you could ever need, and you let your sister beat you. You let the embarrassment of this family take everything from us because you are defective and useless. You ruined my life today." Marcus did not intervene. The patriarch simply sat in his chair, staring blankly at the wall, watching his empire burn to the ground. He did not care that his daughter had just been physically assaulted by his wife. He did not care that his son-in-law was a fraud. He only cared that his bank accounts were frozen and his power was gone. I stood at the end of the table perfectly calm, watching the utter destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. They were tearing each other apart without a second thought. The family loyalty they had always boasted about was a complete myth. Their love was entirely conditional, based purely on what they could extract from one another to maintain their image. The moment the money and the power were gone, the masks fell off and they eagerly cannibalized themselves. I did not need to scream. I did not need to hurl insults or throw things. I had simply held up a mirror and the reflection had driven them entirely insane. I turned my back on the chaos. The sounds of Jada's hysterical sobbing, Trent's panicked shouting, and Vivian's vicious insults faded into background noise. I walked over to the sleek black stroller. My son was still sleeping soundly, completely untouched by the poison in that room. I was safe, and he would never know the cruelty of the people I used to call my parents. I gripped the handle of the stroller, my posture straight, my head held high. Ms. Crawford fell into step beside me as I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. I pushed the doors open, stepping out into the bright, quiet executive hallway. I did not look back. I had a $200 million empire to run, a son to raise, and I had absolutely no time for strangers. Exactly 3 months passed since the day I pushed my son out of that glass boardroom and left my family choking on their own ruin. I did not shed a single tear for them. I did not answer their frantic text messages or listen to the desperate, breathless voicemails they left on my phone in the middle of the night. I simply sat back in the quiet safety of my penthouse holding my baby boy and watched the natural, brutal consequences of their greed consume them alive. There was no tearful reconciliation. There was no grand family meeting where we hugged and decided to put the past behind us. They had drawn the battle lines the night they left me bleeding on the floor, and I was simply enforcing the borders. Trent was the very first to fold, proving exactly what kind of spineless opportunist he truly was. The moment he realized my forensic auditors had successfully frozen the company accounts and severed his access to the family trust, his entire fake persona melted away into sheer panic. He did not comfort Jada. He did not fall to his knees and vow to rebuild their marriage or apologize for his secret life. He filed for a contested divorce less than 48 hours after our boardroom confrontation. But Trent was a parasite to his absolute core, and a parasite always takes one last devastating bite before it completely detaches from its host. I knew Jada was in a state of deep psychological shock, entirely paralyzed by the revelation of his secret family in Florida. Playing on her desperate lifelong need to be chosen, Trent convinced a frantically sobbing Jada that he needed the keys to her custom Porsche to drive to his lawyer's office and secure a defense fund to keep them both out of prison. Jada, so completely terrified of facing the public humiliation of a broken marriage, handed him the keys without a second thought. Trent drove that sports car straight out of Georgia, crossing the state line into Florida, to reunite with the woman and children he actually cared about. He drained whatever meager funds were left in their joint checking accounts, leaving Jada with a mountain of legal fees, an empty garage, and a shattered ego. The golden child who had spent her entire life looking down on me for being single was now a destitute, abandoned woman, forced to pack her designer bags and crawl back to our parents' estate. But Jada's heartbreak was a minor inconvenience compared to the absolute devastation raining down on my father. Marcus had spent his entire adult life believing his wealth made him completely untouchable. He believed he was the undisputed king of Atlanta real estate, a man whose presence commanded immediate respect and unquestioning obedience. But the federal government does not care about bespoke suits or expensive cigars. The forensic audit my legal team handed over to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation painted a horrifying, undeniable picture of decades of wire fraud, tax evasion, and blatant embezzlement. I stood on the balcony of my penthouse with my morning coffee and watched the local news broadcast live helicopter footage of federal agents swarming the Williams Group headquarters. It was a cinematic display of justice. Agents wearing heavy tactical vests, marched out of the glass building carrying dozens of cardboard boxes filled with hard drives, forged contracts, and doctored financial ledgers. Marcus was paraded out of the main lobby in handcuffs. His expensive custom suit was rumpled, his tie was missing, and his face was pale and slick with sweat under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the local news camera flashes. The patriarch who had threatened to destroy my life was now facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He used his one phone call to reach out to his wealthy golf buddies, begging for help to secure his massive bail. Every single one of them sent him straight to voicemail. His high-priced defense attorneys were demanding massive cash retainers he could no longer afford because I controlled the corporate purse strings, and I refused to release a single dime to defend a criminal. And then there was Vivian. My mother had always feared social irrelevance more than death itself. Her entire identity, her self-worth, and her daily oxygen were woven seamlessly into the fabric of Atlanta's black elite. She lived for the exclusive charity galas, the invite-only luncheons, and her coveted position on the regional board of Jack and Jill of America. She believed her pristine social standing elevated her above the rules of basic human decency. But high society is a ruthless, unforgiving ecosystem that despises the stench of failure. The moment Marcus was indicted on federal television and the scandalous truth about Trent's secret second family hit the neighborhood rumor mill, my mother became an overnight social pariah. Her so-called friends women, who had gladly drank her expensive champagne just a month prior, suddenly stopped returning her calls. Her invitations to elite country club gatherings mysteriously vanished in the mail. Vivian tried to attend a high-profile charity auction dressing in her finest gown and acting as if her family was simply the victim of a corporate misunderstanding. She was politely but firmly turned away at the door by a security guard, instructed not to let her ruin the aesthetic of the evening. The final crushing blow to Vivian's ego came 2 weeks later. The executive committee of Jack and Jill formally requested her immediate resignation, citing the public scandal and financial impropriety that now permanently stained our family name. A courier delivered the formal expulsion letter directly to her front door. Vivian was unceremoniously ripped from the only world she ever cared about, stripped of the title and prestige she had sacrificed her own daughter to maintain, cut off from the grandfather trust, and drowning in the legal fees. Marcus was racking up. Vivian faced a terrifying new reality. She had to figure out how to maintain a sprawling multi-million-dollar estate with absolutely zero incoming cash flow. The landscaping bills, the property taxes, the exorbitant utility costs of a mansion all demanded payment. Within 2 months, the woman who had sneered at my practical shoes was quietly scheduling appointments with private estate liquidators. She was forced to secretly pawn her vintage Cartier watches, her diamond tennis bracelets, and the custom emerald necklaces she had flaunted for decades. She sold them for a fraction of their worth just to keep the lights on and the water running in a house that I now legally owned through the holding company. Vivian was desperately selling off her identity piece by piece, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. They were completely pushed out of the elite society they had worshipped, isolated in a massive, quiet house with nothing but their failures and each other's bitter resentment to keep them company. The karma was absolute, methodical, and entirely of their own making. The rain was lashing hard against the reinforced glass windows of my penthouse, turning the sprawling view of the Atlanta skyline into a blurry wash of neon lights and dark shadows. It was past midnight, a time when the city usually quieted down, but tonight the storm outside mirrored the total devastation my family had brought upon themselves. I was sitting comfortably in the oversized armchair in my living room, cradling my baby boy softly against my chest as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. A mug of steaming chamomile tea rested on the marble coffee table beside me. The room was bathed in the warm, dim glow of a single floor lamp, creating an atmosphere of absolute safety and seclusion from the chaotic world outside. Suddenly, the sharp electronic chime of the smart doorbell echoed through the penthouse. I paused, glancing down at the high-definition touchscreen monitor mounted near the kitchen hallway. I did not move from my chair. I simply tapped the screen to activate the live exterior feed, zooming in on the private elevator foyer directly outside my heavy double doors. The image that flickered onto the screen made my chest tighten with a cold, bitter vindication. Standing out there in the pouring rain were Vivian and Marcus. The transformation in just 3 short months was staggering. Gone were the pristine designer suits, the arrogant postures, and the untouchable aura of high society supremacy. My mother was wearing a cheap sodden plastic poncho over a rumpled blouse, her expensive hair completely ruined by the downpour plastered against her weeping face. My father looked 10 years older. His shoulders were hunched, his face unshaven, and his posture broken as he leaned heavily against the wall for support. They looked like desperate beggars shivering in an alleyway, completely stripped of their wealth, their titles, and their dignity. Vivian stepped closer to the camera lens, her face distorted by panic and exhaustion. She began pounding a desperate, trembling fist against the heavy wood of my front door, ignoring the water splashing all around her. "Maya, please open the door!" Vivian cried out, her voice cracking into a pathetic, jagged sob that echoed through the intercom system. "I know you are in there, my baby. Please, you have to help us. The bank has already initiated the foreclosure proceedings on the estate. They are seizing everything, Maya. Your father is facing federal prison time and we have nowhere else to turn. Blood is thicker than water, sweetheart. Family is more important than money. We are your parents. Please just let us in. Let me see my grandson. Give your old parents a second chance." Marcus shuffled forward into the camera frame, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of humility and lingering arrogance. "Maya, listen to your mother. We made mistakes, yes, but we raised you. We gave you a roof over your head. If you have any decency left in you, you will not leave your own flesh and blood out in the storm like stray dogs. Just open the door and talk to us face to face. We are begging you." I sat there in the warm, quiet comfort of my living room, watching them shiver and weep on my doorstep through the cold digital screen. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat. I remembered the exact coldness in their voices when I had called them from the hospital emergency room while bleeding onto their imported rug. I remembered my mother telling me to handle it myself because they were too busy cutting a cake. I remembered my father telling me to go die somewhere else so I would not ruin their reputation. They wanted family, they wanted blood. They had made their definition of those words crystal clear, the night they abandoned me to bleed to death on a dining room floor. I leaned closer to the intercom microphone, my voice steady, calm, and completely devoid of any emotion or malice. "Mom, Dad, can you hear me?" I asked, speaking into the console with chilling composure. Vivian gasped, pressing her face frantically against the glass of the doorbell camera as if she could crawl through the screen. "Yes, yes, we hear you, Maya. Open the door. Please, it is freezing out here." I let out a soft, melodic sigh, looking down at my sleeping baby boy, before raising my eyes back to the screen. "You asked about blood, Mom." I continued, my voice echoing clearly through the speakers in the hallway. "You always said blood is thicker than water. But you forgot the full original proverb. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. The family we choose through loyalty and love will always outweigh the toxic blood relatives who try to destroy us. And you made your choice very clear 3 months ago." Marcus stared blankly into the camera lens, the terrible realization dawning in his tired eyes. "Maya, do not do this. We are desperate. Do you remember the night I called you from the emergency room?" I asked, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Do you remember when I told you I was going into emergency surgery and my heart rate was dropping? Do you remember what you told me?" Mom Vivian began to shake her head violently, sobbing harder as the memory washed over her. "You told me, let her handle it herself. We are busy cutting anniversary cake." I reminded her, every word landing like a physical blow. "You told the nurse to hang up because I was just throwing a tantrum." I paused, letting the silence stretch between us, bridged only by the sound of the heavy rain beating against the building outside. "So let me give you the exact same answer tonight," I whispered into the microphone. "Remember the night I gave birth? Call a cab. Or better yet, call an Uber. Because you have no family here. I am busy rocking my son to sleep." Without waiting for another word, without giving them the satisfaction of another second of my attention, I reached out my hand and pressed the red touch-sensitive button on the screen. The live camera feed instantly cut to black, severing the final pathetic tether they had to my life. I sat back in my armchair, pulling the soft blanket a little higher around my sleeping baby boy. Outside, the storm continued to rage against the glass, but inside there was only the profound absolute silence of total victory. The storm outside my window is now nothing but a distant memory, replaced by the brilliant golden afternoon sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my Atlanta penthouse. The camera glides smoothly across the living room, no longer capturing the cold isolation of a woman fighting for her life, but the vibrant, undeniable warmth of a woman who has already won. I am standing in the center of the room, cradling my beautiful, chubby baby boy against my chest. He kicks his little legs and lets out a bright, echoing giggle that completely fills the expansive space. I look around my home and I do not see a single drop of toxic blood. Instead, I see the family I actively chose, sitting on my plush velvet sofa, entirely off the clock, and laughing, holding a crystal glass of champagne, is Miss Crawford. Next to her is my best friend and business partner, the woman who helped me build my private equity firm from the ground up when my own parents told me I was a failure. In the custom kitchen, my devoted nanny is humming a soft, joyful melody while preparing a bottle. This is what a real foundation looks like. It is not an empire built on deceit, hidden affairs, and stolen trust funds. It is a sanctuary constructed from mutual respect, fierce loyalty, and absolute unconditional support. My son will grow up knowing the weight of a $200 million legacy, but he will never know the suffocating conditional love of the people who tried to steal it from him. I is the heir to a cycle that I permanently broke. I shift my gaze from my smiling son and look directly into the camera lens. I let a slow, entirely peaceful, and fiercely powerful smile spread across my face. Society will always try to guilt you into keeping destructive people in your life. People love to stand at their pulpits and preach that blood is thicker than water. They use that phrase as a weapon to make you tolerate blatant disrespect, abuse, and betrayal just to keep up appearances for the country club. But let me tell you the reality they conveniently leave out. When the blood is poisoned, you have to completely purify your life to survive. You do not owe your peace to anyone just because you happen to share a last name. You do not have to set your own world on fire just to keep your abusers warm. I walked away from the people who literally left me to die, and in return, I gained the entire world. And believe me when I tell you, the absolute sweetest revenge you can ever achieve is massive, undeniable success without them. I turn back to my son, kissing his forehead gently as the camera begins a slow, deliberate retreat. The shot pulls backward smoothly, gliding right through the massive glass windows of my penthouse, putting distance between me and the lens, until I am just a portrait of total peace against the sprawling Atlanta skyline. A heavy, triumphant rhythm and blues soul track kicks in, the bass thumping with a strong, definitive beat. The screen slowly fades to absolute black, leaving nothing behind but the undeniable sound of victory.